I'm just going to play this. This is the procession of Espírito Santo, I believe from 2012, I want to say, possibly 2011. You see the crowns here. Each of these people that are carrying these crowns are related to the each year's organizer of the festival. It's a hand embroidered flag. Another big feature, you see all these Portuguese flags, American flags. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the second half today. This is a flag of Portugal. This is the flag here of the Azores. I'm going to go a little faster through here. Massachusetts. And all the members that you see walking here on the side are both witnessing the parade while they're also walking in it. They're members of the society. And many of them helped found the society. This is the Queen that you saw with the embroidered. And this is coming up towards, actually this is on 28, I believe. Yeah, this is right in front of St. Anthony's Church on 28. And it's interesting because basically the organization gets to shut down this major thoroughfare. And, you know, parades are interesting ways to mark a presence in a community, both participation in a parade or any other kind of parade that you might participate in. So this is the members of the commission, or what are called Mordomos. They are, they're the people that run the feast each year. Interestingly, it was all men this year, not always the case. This is a band that came in, a Portuguese Philharmonica band, or an Azorean rather, Philharmonica band that came in from Fall River. This Philharmonica band tradition is, we talked a little bit about this last week, but it's a really interesting tradition. I wish I could play this music for you. You can't hear the music, can you?
No.
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
But effectively, there's bands like this in every village in Portugal. There are bands like this in many immigrant villages. There's bands like this in Cabo Verde also, Madeira, and other colonial geographies or post-colonial geographies as well. Effectively, it's you know, 200-plus-year-old music instruction emerging out of military bands, but something that's really gone into individual communities that where they learn how to play. You basically learn the solfège method, which is you learn how to hear notes, you learn how to read music, and then you play in these bands. And if you look at these images, it's interesting. There's people there from really young kids to from 7 years old to 70 that participate in these bands. And they're playing music. You can't hear it because I don't know the sound. So this kind of puts you, this was filmed intentionally to kind of give you the feeling of actually being in the parade. And you're walking up behind the commission right here, the Mordomos, as they enter the church, the St. Anthony's Church. This is a group of immigrants from Seta that run this feast. And bottleneck. Right now, they're putting all the crowns that you saw earlier in the parade onto the altar. Further up. And inside the church is organ music playing. But you get the basic idea as they sort of come up into the church. You'll be able to see in just a minute. Like this, just get a pan of the. You can see the crowns all up on the front of the altar, and they really, take over the church for the day. Like, that banner of the association that's draped over the altar is not exactly liturgically accurate. It's really a group of people being able to announce their presence in a place that's changed quite a bit since its original founding. I mean, St. Anthony's Church stopped being a quote unquote Portuguese national church in the 80s, and more recent transformations in the Catholic organization of Falmouth has also sort of transformed St. Anthony's somewhat as well. But for this day, really, this immigrant Portuguese community, or immigrant Azorian community in this case, is able to sort of take back over the space of the church that the immigrants themselves originally founded. So I'll stop that there. Welcome everybody again. We're just looking at some images here ahead of the rest of today's presentation. I'm going to turn things over to Lew now, who's going to talk about, to introduce Lew a little bit. Most of you know him, especially if you participated in last semester's Joy of Learning course. Lew is someone from Falmouth. He has been a lifetime member of the Fresh Pond Holy Ghost Society. He is descended from the original founders of that feast, and is one of the key members of the existing feast itself, the Fresh Pond Feast today. He also wrote a really interesting book about the Fresh Pond Holy Ghost Feast in Falmouth called Sopas. And sopas refers to the soup that's part of the meal that's served to all of the participants in the feast. So Lew, take it away.
Okay. Can you see the screen okay, Miguel?
I can't see the screen, no.
Okay, I should have my shared screen on.
And you have to click on,
it, then I think,
yeah, you have to click on the page you're trying to share too.
Click on the page.
Yeah.
usually
or
it says
whatever.
share, and then there's a little window, and you need to click on that window, and that window will, in that big whole blast of windows that you have, grab one of those windows, and that should be it.
Screen. Okay, there we are.
Yep.
Good.
You got it.
Okay. Well, this is, I'm going to talk about Holy Ghost societies in the Falmouth area. There are a number of them. Most of this information is in the book that Mike was talking about. It's available through the Fresh Pond Holy Ghost Society. I am descended from some of the families. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. I wanted to start by dispelling a popular misconception, which is that the Portuguese really came to Falmouth in the area in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. And while that's the bulk of it, the fact is that Portuguese settlers have been on Cape Cod since before the Revolutionary War, all driven from Nantucket and the whaling ships. That doesn't mean that these people were whaling captains. Most of them just worked on the boats. I'm going to be talking about 5 societies or associations. The Sentuate, Couturette, which was formed in 1891. That's the best date anyone has. The Fresh Pond Holy Ghost Society, and nobody really knows when they began practicing in the area. We know about the Hall. The St. Anthony's Club was a Holy Ghost Society. It was one of the, it was an IDES, founded in 1911, and that lasted through the 20s. That stopped about the time that St. Anthony's Church was consecrated. The Holy Ghost Association in Martha's Vineyard, which is only a few miles away, was founded in the 1920s. They are very active today. And then, of course, the East Falmouth group, which Miguel showed a video of a while ago, and he'll be talking more about them later. They all, and Miguel also talked a little bit about this core belief, the miracle of the roses. There are lots of miracles that are talked about at these feasts, but this is the one that every feast I've gone to, they talk about this one. This particular quote comes directly from the Martha's Vineyard Holy Ghost Association website. And I've just outlined some of the main threads that follow through all of these. There's the crown, of course, which is carried during the procession. You saw that also in the video. It's displayed on the feast, and it's carried by children during the feast. Also, there's an emphasis on kindness to the poor, feeding the poor, and the gifts of bread. And these things, regardless of what else is going on in different Holy Ghost societies, they all have these common themes. We also talked, Miguel spoke last week about the feast in the Azores. These are some of the imperios that I believe these are all from Terceira. I'm not sure. When I was on Pico about 5 years ago, just driving around the island, which is very small, I saw about 22 of these buildings, I think. And they all have similar trappings. They all, and some of them are larger than others, some are more fancy than others, but they all have, what they all have in common is a common meeting area in the middle of the building. At the opposite end of the building, there's usually an altar, and then off to either side, there's a storage area where the crown and other implements, clothing, garments, etc., are stored in between feasts. What I wanted to emphasize on this slide is that this very important person, this is his name in Portuguese. He was known in Falmouth as Joe Andrews. But in 1889, he was also known as Tio Carassa. In 1899, he emigrated with 2 crowns. One was his, the other was his grandfather's. And he brought them to this country. They ended up at the Fresh Pond Holy Ghost Society and the Sentuate Couturette Holy Ghost Society. In Sentuate and Couturette, which again, there's a documented event, May 17th, 1899, when they held a feast for the Holy Ghost. Some of the earliest slide talked about 1836, the 4 seamen from Fayal who jumped ship and swam to shore. One of them, Joseph P. Folger, began working as a laborer in a cranberry bog. And he was extremely thrifty and hardworking, and he later purchased it. And many of the Portuguese immigrants that came into the area found work in Folger's cranberry bogs, including Antone Matthias, whose wife, Jacqueline, actually built a small crown in the front of their room, a small altar. And the most prominent things, there was a statue of Joseph on one side, a statue of the Virgin Mary on the other side. But in the very center, they had displayed the crown of the Holy Ghost. And the very first feast that I could find recorded and documented was May 17th, 1891 in Sentuate, Couturette. In Fresh Pond, it was different. There were a number of people from different islands, mostly from, well, all from the Azores, a lot from Fayal and Pico. Some of them are related. For example, Francisco Texera was the brother of Maria Rosa, excuse me. So here you have this man, Francisco. His sister married my great-grandfather, Joe, should have been Silva. In this country, he's known as White. There are other relationships here. Manuel Vieira Martins, who incidentally was himself from Fayal, married Maria Josefa, who was the sister of Evarista Sylvester. So there are interrelationships, but these families all came together. There's no documentary evidence that I could find as to actual feasts held before then, but we do know that they did found a society. And in 1900, one of the first things they did was they wanted to have a building like an Imperial. And this building originally was a main gathering place. At the far end was an altar, and off to the right was a storage room, same basic structure. This was an abandoned paint shed that they were able to get, with the only provision being that they move it from the property as soon as possible. They disassembled it and built a different building with it that is now the beginning of this hall. Over the years, they've added wings to it. This is the original part of the building from here to here. They later added a cooking area and then an eating area out back, and then concessions over to the side. This talks about the changes, but this is basically, it's not exactly an Imperial, but it's like an Imperial. And when you talk about the rituals at the Holy Ghost in Fresh Pond, that's one of the main things, is that we do have this Imperial to house the garments and all the different things that are used, the flags, etc. As with other Holy Ghost societies, there are Domingas that begin on Easter Sunday, and there are 8 of them lasting from Easter Sunday through Pentecost Sunday. And during each Sunday, the crown moves from one member's house to another member's house, and they have like a little procession from one house to the other. And when they get to that house, they say prayers. And this is, again, common to most Holy Ghost societies. Similarly, there's a procession. It's gotten shorter over the years as the organization has gotten smaller, but they still have a procession. And in this procession, it's always featured is the child who wears the crown. They also have the tradition of soupage, which again, every Holy Ghost society has them. I've been to a lot of these feasts, and I can honestly say that at no 2 feasts are the soupage the same. They're all very, very different. The ones in Fresh Pond are rooted very much in what was being practiced in 1890 Pico and Fayal. Interestingly enough, the one in Sentuate, Couturette, which is basically the same group of people, although their feast is about as long, their soupage has evolved very, very much. Fresh Pond very much less so. Preparation normally starts 3 days before the festa, and the morning of the feast, the priest always comes for the prayers, and in some places it's the blessing of the meat. This in Fresh Pond, they actually have separate prayers to bless the bread, the wine, the meat, the spices, the faithful hearts of the members, and the hands that prepare the feast. When the meal begins, and we talked a little bit about sequence at some of these other feasts, the very first to eat was always the band. They were the first ones served. They were the ones that normally led the procession. And they would stop and play in front of the hall itself. And the last thing they would play would be the hymn of the Holy Ghost. And when they had done that, they would eat, even before the workers. The workers ate after the band, the members after the workers, and after that, by this time, it's about noontime, everyone is welcome. And this is everyone and anyone that shows up. This is the part that commemorates feeding the poor, taking care of the poor. There is no charge for this meal, and it's open for anybody that shows up. Miguel talked about, I can't even say that word, pensaos, how they funded the feast by collecting money ahead of time. They don't do that in Fresh Pond, and they never have. The feast has always been funded by the auction, which is held after the feast, and the auction is typically items that are homemade or homegrown or home cooked goods, and sometimes they're commercial goods that are donated by members, and they're auctioned off at ridiculous prices because it is the members' way of funding the festa. At last feast I went to, which now is 3 years ago, there was a loaf of sweetbread that auctioned off for $35. Now, that's not an auction price, but it's, again, a way of contributing. They also fund it with breakfasts, and traditionally they have done it with a lot of fundraisers, whist parties, malasadas, pig roasts, lots of different ways to, but it's all centered around funding the feast, and of course the including the Imperio itself. The last thing that happens is preparations for the next festa. That's the last thing that's done when the feast is all over. The members all get together and select who will have the crown for the following 8 years. And the crown will then go, and the crown will go first to the first one. The last person, the eighth Domingo, that person is the Mordomo. They're in charge of the next feast. And that's the fresh pond. Our crown,
8 weeks, Lew. 8 weeks of the next year.
8 weeks, yes.
Just to clarify.
Yes, from Easter Sunday to Pentecost Sunday. This is, again, this is from the Fresh Pond Feast. This is one of the crowns brought over by Joe Andrews in 1889. The other one belongs to the Couturette Holy Ghost Society. This is a smaller crown that was acquired over the years. Practices have changed. There used to be 2 feasts back in the 30s, 40s, 50s. One was called the Small Feast, which is mainly for members and families. And the Pentecost Sunday Feast was open to everybody. This shows the meal that is served. These panellas, these copper panellas, actually we can't use them anymore. They've been outlawed because they violate health rules. But when this picture was taken, we're still using them. The meal itself consists of Portuguese bread, and the kind of Portuguese bread, again, varies from organization to organization. But the bread is sliced 3 days ahead of time to give it time to dry out, and then it's put in this pan with layers of mint, hortelã. This is a Portuguese mint. Bread, hortelã, and so on. It's then soaked with a low-fat beef broth that is cooked by the association, and it is served with meat, cabbage, and onions. There have been variations. A couple of years ago, we started adding linguiça and chorizo. But this is the old style meal that is served there, and it's to give you an idea of the amount of meat that is actually consumed. It works out to almost a pound per person that attends the feast. I mean, it's amazing. The procession itself, this goes back to the early days. This area here is Martin Road. And this particular feast, this is going back to the 1910 map, the parade began at Louis Santos' house, and who lived next to Barrows. I didn't realize that until I saw this map. But this is where the parade began. And I think this is from, I don't remember the year, but there were several from Louis Santos' house. And it proceeds all the way down what is Martin Road, down through Walk White, past, this is where the carriage shop used to be. The carriage shop road is named after. There used to be a mill here. It continues on through Fresh Pond to, to this junction right here, which is where the Fresh Pond Hall is. Here's another member of the Joe Souza, another member of the association. And I guess, okay, the procession itself has varied over the years. Also, and typically the procession was led by members followed by with flags of the association of the country and of Portugal and of the Azores. And this was a rosary that the sisters had made that girls would carry during the parade, and they would actually say the rosary as they were marching from Louis Santos' house to the hall. Back in the, I don't know about beforehand, but in the 50s, I know they had a float because this one has my sister on it, Susan, and my other sister, Phyllis. It was towed, I think, by a tractor. This is a more recent photograph showing girls arriving at, this is the arch in front of the Holy Ghost Hall. Okay. This is another, this picture actually comes from the East Falmouth Azorians, East Falmouth IDS. This is the band that they had for their feast. It's very much what happened back when I was growing up in the 50s. And after they finished playing here, they would then go in and be the first, literally played for their meal. Okay, the Sisters of the Holy Ghost are another, this, in Fresh Pond, the Fresh Pond, many organizations are called a brotherhood. The Fresh Pond Holy Ghost Society really was a brotherhood. Only men to this day can be members of the Fresh Pond Holy Ghost Association. There was a sisters organization that was very active in the 30s and through the 60s. This shows Elsie Texera, who was very prominent in the organization. Mrs. Sousa's also there. And my sister was president for a while in the 60s, Susan. They were responsible for raising a lot of the money through the year that actually helped cover the expenses, card parties, dinners, malasadas, other things. This is another funny thing, but the unmarried sisters held their own prayers between Easter and Pentecost. These are during the Domingas. But the married sisters and their husbands would go to the same building to say prayers, but they would say them in separate rooms. And it was kind of, I thought it was kind of funny when I went, because the women would be in the living room saying prayers, and the men would be in the dining room saying same prayers, same times, but part of the tradition was separate rooms. They also were very active, of course, in preparing the food, waiting on tables, and they handle pretty much all the decorations and whatnot that are used by the association. This is to give you an idea of the Sentuate Couturette feast. Again, they have a similar hall. They have a tent outside. They have eating inside. I don't know about their procession. I do know that the meal is similar but different. You can recognize it as being soupish, but the flavors are different. The cuts of meat are different. The vegetables are different. Even the spices are different. And this is not uncommon. When I went to Pico, where my family came from, I thought I was going to have soupish there and it would be like what we served. And it was unrecognizable because theirs had evolved over the years. And of course, we tried to keep it pretty much the same. This is an auction. Again, this is how they pay for their feast, although they also have other events during the year, including a pig roast. In Martha's Vineyard, again, similar kinds of things. They have their own hall. This is Patricia Bergeron, who's the president. What's unique about Martha's Vineyard is that if you look at a list of offices, you won't find a single Portuguese name, but they've carried the tradition on. They are very, very active, and all of these organizations are active in feeding the poor and in taking care of the poor, not just during the feast, but at other times during the year by making various donations to different causes, fundraisers, etc. At the Martha's Vineyard, which is also called the Oak Bluffs Feast, they have a very small procession, but again, they do have their own crown. They have the crowning here. What's a little bit different is that this is a minister, not a Catholic priest. The minister comes to the feast and administers the same kind of service, culminating in the crowning of a young girl as queen. This is a crowd outside the feast, and this is the traditional Folklorico dancers that they bring in. I think these were from Pawtucket, I'm not sure, but they have both a band and the dancers. As this has not only been a Holy Ghost hall, which means it's not just used for Holy Ghost feasts. It was also used before St. Anthony's Church was built as a place where a traveling priest would say mass here every Sunday mornings, very early, so that the pickers could get out afterwards. But it's also served for a number of Portuguese organizations, especially the strawberry growers, the Shellfish Association. There was an organization called the Portuguese American Civic League that was very active back in the 30s and 40s. They would meet here. As a matter of fact, some of the bands that we used during the feast were PACL bands out of Plymouth. Taxi drivers have met there. There was an organization active called the Daughters of Isabella. For a while, they met there. It's, of course, been used for family functions. A lot of wedding receptions, showers, anniversary, reunions. As a matter of fact, today, the feast that is held on Pentecost Sunday has in fact become a reunion time for many of the Portuguese families, and they have their reunions scheduled around the feast so that they can all meet at the feast and participate together. It's being used for some religious events, communion breakfasts, Christmas parties, a lot of entertainment for fundraising. It has also been a safety net for members. People have come there to bring things for people that have experienced unfortunate events, especially when they didn't have insurance. It was very common. We heard of one last week. There was another one that I'm aware of for Frank Texera. This is the father, not Frank Jr., whose house burned down, and the members refurbished it, including a lot of things like kitchen stoves. And they've also done a lot for donation equipment loans. For example, I think you look back in the 50s, they had a huge tent that they retired. Well, they kept the tent for many years, and they would loan it out to people that needed it. I know that, I remember in particular a lobster bake at the St. Anthony's Club, where they used the tent from the Fresh Pond Holy Ghost. That pretty much wraps it up. There is going to be a feast this year at Fresh Pond on June 5th. These other dates I'm guessing at, I don't know. The Day of Portugal is typically held by the Portuguese American Club. The Holy Ghost Society in Sentuate is the 19th. I don't know, the Martha's Vineyard is always the third Sunday in July, but I spoke to them yesterday, and they're still debating whether or not to do it this year. Fresh Pond is going ahead. I don't know about the East Falmouth IDS. I know they've moved the feast this year, I believe, to the Portuguese American Club, which has a lot more parking. I mean, one of the problems we've had with the Fresh Pond Holy Ghost Hall is that there is very, very limited parking, and as development has continued, it's becoming more and more of a problem. The Portuguese American Club has immense parking spots, so they shouldn't have a problem there. That pretty much wraps up the what I had. I was told to keep it to 30 minutes, and I think that's pretty close.
It's great, Lew.
Thanks. That was great.
Thanks so much. Let's hold questions until the very end after we finish talking about, and again, Lew, as always, feel free to jump in, correct me, and if you have anything else to add, please add it. I mostly talked last time about the East Falmouth group, but very, very quickly to talk about East Falmouth. I've been doing some anthropological research on that feast, as well as going to it since the 80s. But basically, it's a group founded by immigrants in 1983. The feast has been, it's really interesting. I actually would really just like to kind of talk about it a little bit in the context of the older feasts, in that nowadays there are members in both organizations. What's interesting is that Lew talked about the sopish and the style of the sopish at the Fresh Pond Feast. And the reason that they thought about having linguiça and chorizo in it is because that's what's done at the Azorean feast, or the immigrant feast, the newer feast. That's a style that they have. Everybody loves it. And there was some discussion about keeping it, the way that it was done, or quote unquote traditional. This word we've talked about for the last couple of weeks now. What does it mean to say something's traditional? Oftentimes, it's not really that's not really a scientific category, something that's traditional, or a historical category, something that's traditional. It's an argument, and it's an argument that's made to try and communicate certain kinds of information. So it's how groups are able to distinguish themselves is by these kinds of distinctions. Oftentimes, something being named as traditional is a way to distinguish oneself from, or one group from, a different group. But it's interesting that I think that there was a compromise one year where they didn't actually cook the chorizo in the soup at Fresh Pond, but they served it on the side, right?
That's true. That's true.
Yeah. So see, and it really points to the fact that these rituals are.
Miguel, it's still an argument. I don't think we're going to do it this year.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, but it speaks to these feasts as adaptations. There's no one thing. They adapt to particular circumstances in the present. Like, for example, if we look at the Sentuate feast, what kind of music do they have at their feast? They have a country western band play at their feast, because most of the people that participate in that feast, there aren't any immigrants that really belong to that feast anymore. And they hire the kinds of music and the kinds of activities that they like. The Martha's Vineyard feast is really interesting. One of the images that you saw in Lew's slide was of a folklore band, not from the Azores, where these feasts are mostly from, but rather was a folklore band from Madeira. The other interesting thing is that Oak Bluffs also has, where that feast is held, is a really interesting community. There's a lot of African Americans that live in that community, and they are also supporters of of that feast as well, as are many of the other people that just live in Martha's Vineyard. So it's not really, it's kind of become not so much an Azorean feast, but an Oak Bluffs community feast in some ways. It's a big draw for tourists and the like. And they kind of, they base it in the notion of having something that was, a Portuguese quote unquote feast, but it's not really in some ways. At least that one is not so much. So we look at these feasts and they're all very different. Each expression of the feast is quite different. Who runs it, who practices it, who works on it is really quite different. And one of the things that we can talk about, and this will be a segue into the next part. Actually, if there's any quick questions for Lew, maybe we'll go those. You can quickly ask those if there's any specific questions that you all have about the feast. Otherwise, hold them to the end, and we will, and we can talk about everything at the whatever questions you have at the end. We'll talk about them. So the segue that I would have is that during this early period, what's really interesting is that, as Lew said, St. Anthony's Church, when St. Anthony's Church was founded, the St. Anthony's Club feast ended, and that's not an accident. The impetus of the people that were organizing that Holy Ghost Society put all of their work then into the church. Like, in fact, all over New England, oftentimes before there's a church, a Portuguese Catholic church was founded in Portuguese communities in New England. There was a Holy Ghost feast or a Holy Ghost Society that preceded it, and that actually organized and fundraised in order to be able to create that church. Obviously there wasn't the only source of fundraising for that, but these organizations were really community centers as much as they were socio-religious rituals that were taking place year in and year out. There's two other things I'd like to bring up, which is Lew briefly made mention to the women's auxiliary, but these were also very segregated spaces in terms of women and men as well. Oftentimes they were segregated in terms of who could belong and who couldn't belong. You had to be from a particular island to belong to certain feasts. As we talked about last week, during the 50s and sort of the post-World War II racism that was taking place in the US, or transformations in racism in the US that took place during post-World War II period, you also have some of these organizations redefining it for whites only, which is, or at least one. This took place in that I was able to find in explicitly one in Newport, Rhode Island. So again, these rituals, we think of them as community rituals, but they're political rituals also. They're rituals of definition. They're rituals of exclusion and exclusion. The segue I would make here is that I'm going to share my screen now. Is that oftentimes one of the things that one of the kinds of research that I like to do is I like to go into old newspapers or newspapers, not only Portuguese newspapers, but English language newspapers, and try and look up how people were writing about Portuguese Cape Verdeans in the early part of the century, the latter part of the 19th century, when they started to come in significant numbers, So hopefully you all can see a picture of rituals and festivals, Cape Verde, blah, 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 rights of exclusion and belonging. Yep. If you could just say yes. My slide, can everybody see my slideshow? Yeah.
Good, see it.
Yeah, okay, all right, thanks. So oftentimes what you have is expressions of these, in English language newspapers where they're characterizing, most of the early stuff that you find is that, from criminal report records, or there's a murder attempt, and this is where they talk about the Portuguese. Sometimes there's international news that takes place where they talk about Portugal itself, but usually when they talk about local communities of Portuguese Cape Verdeans, they're talking about negative things that are taking place in criminal reports and these kinds of things. Where that starts to change is with the organizations that these groups founded. So you start to see a major transformation take place in two cases. One takes place with the founding of the Holy Ghost feasts. And many of the newspapers start to talk about the religious, industrious Portuguese and these organizations that they have founded. The other takes place specifically in Falmouth with the founding of the Cape Verdean Citizens Political Club, which becomes a conduit for Cape Verdeans and as well as other Portuguese at the time. They were founded in the 30s to exercise political power and also have a civic voice in town. I'm going to tell a little aside here, and then I'm going to jump back into what I'm talking about. So right after 9/11, I was working I was a graduate student at that point at Brown, and I was teaching some anthropology classes at UMass Dartmouth. And 9/11 hit, and we had a class, right after that, and or the first class that we had after 9/11. There was a kid in the class whose name was Mohammed. He was an Egyptian kid, and he started to wear this American flag T-shirt every day. Just everywhere he went, he wore this American flag T-shirt. And my first thought was, it just pissed me off that he felt that he had to do. I mean, obviously he was looking out for his own safety, but that he was trying to communicate something about himself during this horribly ugly time, in which anybody that looked Middle Eastern or was Middle Eastern, was being attacked by many people in the U.S. And where there was this incredible, horrible conflation between the acts of these horrible criminal terrorist thugs with immigrants in the U.S. And this is something that happens and was happening and still happens today. However, it really upset me, and I asked him. I said, I just talked to him about it a little bit. He said, look, he said, it's probably a pain that I need to do this, and I would rather not do this, but I'm able to very quickly and easily communicate in a very quick and easy way, who I am and what I care about and what's important to me. And in any case, I want you to think about that example when we talk about some of the things that I'm going to talk about next, which I'm going to expand now from Holy Ghost to talk about the Holy Ghost feast, to talk about other forms of rituals in which Portuguese Cape Verdeans participated in this early period. And if I say Portuguese, I'm including people from all of these just geographies, given that all of the people that we're talking about during this time period were Portuguese passport holders. It's important, of course, to talk about distinctions between these geographies and specific issues faced by these individuals, which I've done at length in many other discussions and many other talks that I've given. This one, I'm specifically talking about the participation of these groups in what could be considered quote unquote American rituals, 4th of July, memorials for the war dead, and other kinds of pageants. So I'm gonna go through and just, we have about 10 minutes left before we get to questions. I'm gonna just go through and give you some examples of some of these kinds of events that the Portuguese participated in and how they were characterized locally as a result of that participation. So the first that I would like to talk about is the 1881 funeral cortege of President James Garfield. Typo. But in any case, people think, of course, of Portuguese immigration as being something that's limited mostly, or at least in this later period, we think of it as New England, we think of it as California. But the fact is, there were also other pockets and areas of, of Portuguese migration. This includes, Hawaii in the 1870s, where Portuguese, and it's mostly migrant mobile laborers who are going places to work on fields, work in farms, work in industrial mills. They were being recruited from places in the Azores. They were being recruited from continental Portugal, Madeira, from Cabo Verde, and they were going to all these places to work in, in various capacities. There were a number of individuals that went in the mid 1800s, or actually earlier than that, because that's when they start founding their associations, is in the mid 1800s in New Orleans, most likely working in sugarcane. It's one of my next projects that I'm interested in looking at is what were these individuals doing there. I've not found any original scholarship on this topic yet. I would be excited if there was some. However, a lot of these mobile workers went there. These organizations that they founded were, as Lew says, oftentimes beneficent societies. They looked out for the members. They took care of them. When they got sick, they took care of them. When they got, when they were, needed, it was a form of insurance that they were able to, that they were able to use or rely upon, rather, by paying in benefits to each other. A couple of these organizations were in New Orleans. New Orleans is a really interesting place. It continues to be to this day, but at this time especially, you had all of these societies and guilds, and these societies and guilds created quite a segregated city. It segregated different kinds of groups of migrants. It segregated blacks from whites, and participation was often allowed with all of these groups. However, they had to participate separately. They couldn't participate with each other. So what happened was I came across two Portuguese organizations that participated in the funeral cortege of James Garfield. When James Garfield died, he was put on his body, his remains were placed on a train, traveled all over the country, and there were in different cities they would have these funeral processions. And one of these funeral processions was greatly detailed by an author who was present at it, and he listed all of the organizations in New Orleans that participated in it, and also went around and asked for information about these organizations. So we have some information about these groups, and you can see how all of these groups coming together, how these groups were able to make a place for themselves in this segregated city by participating in these kinds of rituals. That's one kind. Obviously, the death of a president is a national ritual, a ritual of national civic belonging. Well, what's another one? 4th of July parades. 4th of July parades, along with Holy Ghost, are where you see the earliest mentions of the Portuguese as being, it's being spoken of in a positive light. So in some research in the Lowell Daily Sun, which was a newspaper out of Lowell, Massachusetts, I came across instances of the Portuguese organizations, Portuguese civic societies participating in 4th of July parades. So I found them really basically from 1896 on. The first one I found was in 1896, and then they continue after that. But in some of these talks, or in some of the write-ups about who was participating in the 4th of July parade, you have a mention that in 1890s, this very, very early period, where Portuguese start to get positive press. And in fact, they even get positive press vis-a-vis other immigrant groups. most of these organizations that ran these were not immigrants. They were, they were white, Anglo-Saxon organizations. They were usually the most traditional, the oldest, the wealthiest people in the town. The organizations that to be able to march in this was, on the one hand, showing your civic belonging, but on the other hand, it was also demonstrating a kind of acquiescence with this power structure, or signaling one's ability or one's desire to belong to that power structure. That's a very important thing to keep in mind as we talk about the rest of this. So 4th of July parades, and to this day, they continue. So Bristol, Rhode Island, for example, which this image is from right here. This is from the Bristol, Rhode Island 4th of July parade. Is the oldest in the country, as many of us know. Actually, many of us maybe don't know that. If we were from Rhode Island, we would. But in Rhode Island, everyone knows that the Bristol 4th of July parade is the oldest in the country. It was founded, I believe, in 1785, shortly after the Revolution, and has been ongoing since then. Bristol is also, if you don't know, one of the main destinations for Portuguese immigrants in the earlier part of the 20th century as well as in the post-1960s period. And shares some actually kind of similar conditions with Falmouth. It has some proximity to agricultural communities, but with most of the people coming to Bristol as a result of having worked in mills. How that 4th of July parade has transformed to not only include the Portuguese, but for the Portuguese to gain a very central role in it is something that we can also talk about in Falmouth. The way that many of the rituals in town that were outside of Portugal, where the Portuguese were definitely outsiders in, have over time come to incorporate the Portuguese Cape Verdean communities very much as insiders. I want to focus right now on this earlier period, and I want to talk a little bit about the 4th of July parades related to the movement to Americanize the immigrant, and then later on, I'd like to talk about the Pilgrim commemorations that took place. So the 4th of July parades, we talked about last semester when we, in our Joy of Learning course, about the movement to Americanize the immigrants and how a group of progressives, although when we say progressives, we should be really careful, because really what this was an early 1920s, on the one hand, effort to show that immigrants, as well as African Americans, were not genetically inferior to people who were considered whites at the time. However, their problem, according to the people that promoted the Americanization movement, was that they lacked education, literacy, and civic training to be able to become full civic participants. Now, this is progressive when one considers the amount of voices saying that people should be excluded as a result of being, racially inferior. However, not so progressive when one considers that what they were arguing was that all of these immigrant groups should abandon all of their cultural backgrounds, abandon all of their traditions, and embrace Americanization. It gets very, very complicated, as I've talked in other lectures. I encourage you to go look at some of those. They're all online at Joy of Learning, and they're also online. A couple of the others similar talk I gave at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. However, the Americanization Day was a national organization of associations in which the Portuguese associations, like Holy Ghost societies and other beneficent societies such as the Portuguese fraternity, also participated in. And what they did was they called for a national celebration of all of the immigrant groups to participate in the 4th of July. And there was a major one in 1915. And they had hoped that by doing this, the organizations, and this again in 1915, we're in the middle of World War I. There begins to be a large amount of anti-immigrant sentiment, not only because of industrial millwork, but because of World War I. And this was a way for these immigrant groups to show that they belonged. They were able to communicate or their civic belonging. In other words, it's kind of like wearing an American flag T-shirt if you're, from Egypt after 9/11. And they were able to, to communicate their belonging through this. Another one that I'll talk about quickly is the Pilgrim commemorations that took place. We're in the middle of it really right now. Actually, 9/11, the COVID sort of ended all of the 400-year anniversary celebrations that were to take place in 2020. However, in 1920, you had all of these pilgrim commemorations. The pilgrims become a really interesting way to make arguments, both by people who didn't want the immigrants in America and also by the people who were sympathetic to the immigrants' cause. There very complicated arguments get made about the pilgrims. Basically, one of the arguments that gets told in this sort of whitewashing of the role of the Native Americans in the pageant, of course. But one of the things that gets talked about in that whitewashing, or gets used for political purposes, is that is the whole story gets kind of taken away from the people who are trying to whitewash it to say, well, if they got along so well, and if there were such friendly relations, there weren't. There's this mythology of the peaceful settlement of New England. It's of course a myth. There were all kinds of wars going on. The Puritans, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, sided with one faction in the wars that were taking place, and supported them. And it was a very complicated situation. Obviously, Native Americans were also being sold into slavery, captured and sold into slavery by many of these English settlers. But the story sort of gets whitewashed as a moment of great community and communal belonging between the Native Americans and the Pilgrim settlers. And what the immigrants say is, well, if there was such a notion of immigrants of peace between these groups, well, then why aren't the English doing the same thing with the immigrant settlers, the way that the Native Americans did with the Pilgrims? And so this becomes one of the discourses that takes place during the 1920s with a lot of pro-immigrant groups to make arguments. And what you start to see is that a lot of these immigrant groups are brought into some of the Pilgrim celebrations and all the pageants that took place, dedications to the Pilgrims. Now, you have to remember that even the notion of Thanksgiving is a very new notion, and it only really started this sort of National Day of Thanksgiving starts in the 19th century. Doesn't really get officially recognized until the 40s, as Roz Edwards told us in our first meeting. But what happens is these pageants actually go quite far in establishing the idea of Thanksgiving as something that should be celebrated. And you have a bunch of them in this area, or in the area around southeastern New England. You have one taking place in Plymouth, obviously, and also one in Provincetown, where, remember, the Pilgrims originally landed before deciding that they didn't want to eat these disgusting lobsters all over the beach. If they arrive now, they'd have a different idea. And before they decided to go try and find better soil off Cape. But in any case, there's a major 1920 celebration of not only the Pilgrim's arrival in Provincetown, but also the 10-year anniversary of dedication of the memorial that was built there and dedicated in 1910. You have the St. Michael Society. Guess what? That's a Holy Ghost society. And you have the Portuguese fraternity, which we've talked about many, many times, both in the previous Joy of Learning as well as in this version, which was a major political organization, civic organization. Both of these organizations participated and were actually members of these were honorary vice presidents of the event, and also were members of the organizational committee of the Pilgrim festivals. So again, this sort of fits in with some of the things that we were talking about. I would move on and finally talk about memorials to war dead. Memorials to war dead are really very, very interesting rituals, or that form part of the kind of rituals that we have. How we ritualize and treat and memorialize individuals who have died. And what you start to see are many Portuguese. Of course, there are many Portuguese who were Cape Verdeans, Azorians, people from Continent, Madeira, that start fighting for and dying in American wars. They're soldiers. And I would actually encourage everybody to go to as I do almost every week, to go to the Cape Verdean Museum on Davisville Road at the Emerald House. They have a whole room dedicated to, or a whole exhibit dedicated to Cape Verdeans serving in the U.S. military. And this is very, very important for immigrants who are able to, there's really no more way to be apotheosized for an immigrant group to be apotheosized than to have members of a community who fight for and die in another country's war. This shows incontrovertibly that they belong to America, that they are a part of America, by making the ultimate sacrifice, to the military endeavors of a nation to which they have immigrated, shows incontrovertibly. And these are all memorials outside of Falmouth Public Library. I don't know if any of you better have a chance to walk through there. But there's a World War I memorial there. And there's also a memorial to other war dead of Falmouth. And these are from World War II and from the Vietnam War that are right outside. And you can see these names, Portuguese and Cape Verdean names, Azorians that all fought and died in U.S. wars. So this is another, but for the individuals that died themselves, as we say, all funeral rites are less about the dead than they are about the living in anthropology. We're not talking about the spirituality and what happens, the beliefs that people have about what happens to someone's soul or what happens to someone in the afterlife, but we're talking about how people go through the actual process, the social process of mourning, how they go through the social process of trying to deal with having lost loved ones. And oftentimes, these rites are about the living more so than they are about those who have passed away. To publicly name and memorialize these individuals is a very important and powerful way for immigrant groups to be recognized by a community and to be recognized as belonging to a community. Everywhere you go all over the place, you have these kinds of memorials to war dead, and how immigrants are memorialized in these and how other groups that have been excluded or marginalized by society are memorialized by these are an extremely important way or extremely important part of the immigrant experience. And another important thing for us to talk about as how rituals of belonging take place within immigrant communities. So I'll stop there. I would open it up if there's any. There's some. I see already. There's some chats here about malasadas. Yeah, to answer Doreen's question, I actually posted a kind of a neat little video that I made and cut together while working on Holy Ghost feasts with a Holy Ghost feast that takes place in Providence at Nuestra Senora del Rosario Church. It's the women that run their malasadas crew, and they talk about all the different recipes. Even the women that make them in one feast, they all come from different places, and there were different recipes they have. And it's a huge argument that takes place among the women that make malasadas. They all talk about the malasadas as being, some put aguardiente in it, which is like a Portuguese grain alcohol. Others don't. There's all kinds of different recipes that really have to do with, again, how one learned how to make them themselves, and then how things transform once they go into a immigrant context. Any other questions for Lew, for myself about any of this? Go ahead. I can't see your name, but whoever if you have your hand up, just jump in. Just remember, just hit the space bar and then just start jumping. Jump in.
Okay, this is David, and you may have addressed this in another course. I don't know, but anyway, I'm two questions. One is wondering how much influence Portugal actually has, how these societies look back to Portugal, or do they? Because there were stepping stones of Cape Verdes and Azores. So these communities in Falmouth look to those islands or to Portugal as kind of their reference point. That's one question. Or I guess the Portuguese language is the encompassing phenomenon there. I don't know, and the culture has spread from Portugal, but it definitely has these flavors of these islands, doesn't it? And the ancestry is from these particular islands for the most part here in Falmouth, isn't it?
Yeah. I'll answer that question, and then you have a part two to it. I don't know if it's related.
Yeah, I have another question.
Is it related, or should I answer?
Go ahead. Answer that one first. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's important to remember that these islands were all settled 500, 600 years ago, right? So they're 3 times older than the United States. When we think of the United States, but we think that the United States, what's the relationship of the United States to England and to English culture? Well, sure, it's related, but it's also not related. So I think for many of these islands, island groups, especially those that then migrated to the US, their point of reference is to the islands. that they're from. Most definitely. Of course, there's this political component of it also, in that, remember that these are all holders of Portuguese passports, at least those that come before the 70s. Include, they still are for everyone else, but when Cape Verde gets fights a colonial war, or participates in a broader colonial war and against Portugal, they become an independent nation, right, in the 70s. So there's a political reference to Cabo Verde as a nation. But it was also extremely important, and this actually forms one of the, I think, the most important and fascinating aspects of, and what really separates migration from Portugal, the nation, including all those geographies, from many other places, European migrants that people often try and include Portugal in, is that you have all these different geographies. There are individuals who, on the one hand, will have an identity that is, will claim an identity that is, how do you want to call it? That's both Portuguese on the one hand, depending on the context, but also not Portuguese, depending on another context. So, until the 1950s, for example, if you were born or if you were from an African nation, you were not allowed to become a citizen of the United States. It wasn't until 1952 that law changed. So imagine being someone from Cabo Verde who comes to the US, that immigrates to the US. It's very much in their interest to call themselves Portuguese, because how are they going to ever become a U.S. citizen if that's something that they wanted? That doesn't, there's all kinds of other multiple layers of these identities, of exclusion, of racism, of who's considered in and out, both by the WASPs against the new immigrants, by the immigrants themselves, different immigrants against one another, by the Portuguese themselves against other kinds of Portuguese, right? So there's all of these complex layers, but the short answer to your question is I think that people, their most direct connection is to their island where they came from. And then after that, things build and, develop from there. And then in the more recent years, Portugal becomes a gloss for some of these immigrants, that's much broader and wider. So, yeah.
Okay, I've got another question.
I'd like to add something to that, because I think the tie, going to get back to this tie to the islands, it's very strong. I know that a lot of the original people, like if you go to the founders of the Holy Ghost Society and Fresh Fund, many of them made repeated trips back to the islands. It was nothing for them to go back 5 or 6 times. I know in my own family, my dad went back to the islands 11 times to visit. He wasn't even born there. So it's a very strong tie. The other thing is that if you look at the dates on the imperios that are built in the islands, the dates on the buildings tie back very closely to when the immigrants in this country would have sent money back to their families. And I think that some of that money ended up back building imperios.
Exactly. Like we think of those imperios as traditional, right? But if we look at them, most of those imperios were founded after the Holy Ghost Feast in the US.
That's right. That's right.
So, where's the traditions coming from, right? The traditions are really coming from here and going back to those islands. So that's another interesting wrinkle for you, David. You had another. There's a really, really fascinating comment here by Doreen, but let me get. What was your second question first, David?
Okay, my second question was: I became aware that there's growing a recent influence of Brazilians in Falmouth area. So, is there a Brazilian American society? And
yeah. So, as part of the Migrant Communities Project exhibit, the temporary exhibit that was created for the opening of the Cape Verdean Museum, we actually one of the groups of community historians looked at Brazilian community in Falmouth. I'll be happy to send their slideshow to you. It might be interesting. But I would anyway. I'll send that to you.
Please,
and but mostly their community organizations are in the churches that they belong to. So in some ways, not very different from the Azorians and the Cape Verdeans when they first came to the U.S. In this 1890s period. That a lot of the community life revolved around the church. And there are some other organizations or cultural organizations that a lot of the immigrants from Brazil have. A few years back, some of them actually started to have events at the Portuguese American Association. That I don't know if that's still happening, but in any case, that's one thing to talk about.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, one thing that I've encouraged actually in talking to them is wondering how, you know, just to start like these organizations, or once you have these community organizations, is really a way to get visibility in the community and society. One of the things I'm going to try and talk about next week, for example, is the Jamaican Feast, for example. You know, like people don't really think of Jamaican immigration in Falmouth necessarily as a large migrant group, but it's one of the main migrant groups in Falmouth are people who come and work from Jamaica. Many of the people from Jamaica have settled in Falmouth, and you know, there's a visibility that takes place at that Cooney-Messett Farms event that takes place during the summertime. So Dorian has a really fascinating comment here that this is something that when I find out these kinds of things, I really want to do more research on and find out more about it. But I'll read it. It says, due to military racism and his selection of Christian, I guess, correct, Dorian, you should probably just tell the story, but I guess Ernest Barrows said that he was Christian, which meant to him that he was Catholic because he was Catholic. But because it was seen as him being not Christian, not Catholic, but rather he was labeled as a Baptist because he was Black, not white, resulted him in being buried in the Old Town Cemetery instead of St. Anthony's with his mothers and relatives. So that is something, and his mothers and relatives are, I assume, buried at St. Anthony's Church. So that is really fascinating. I'd love to learn more about that. And would love to know, Doreen, do you have anything maybe to augment or to add there on that comment? Hit spacebar, Doreen. Hit spacebar.
Ernest's mother, Mary Gomes, had died of TB. So, and then following, the next person to die was Ernest, and my great grandfather shortly after. But everyone in the family was pleading with the army, and there was only a couple choices of your religion at that time. And it was, I don't have the form right in front of me, but there were exact choices. And so most of the Catholics, there wasn't an exact box to check that said Catholic, basically. And because he was Black, they made him a Baptist. And since it took so long, I mean, nearly a year for his body to come home, they had that time to be pleading, saying he is Catholic, he is baptized, he is, here's a baptism, we have family St. Anthony's. And the military said they would not pay for a Black man to be buried unless he was going to a Baptist cemetery. So at the time, people didn't have really the money to pay for the whole funeral process, but there's numerous articles in the Falmouth Enterprise about his death. None of them mentioned the issue of him not being in St. Anthony's. I guess it wasn't political correct. No one took up the story of the family's hostility of him being buried at the Old Town Cemetery. But the whole town came out for a couple days when his body was flown back to Falmouth to pay their respects. And there's at least 3 articles in the Enterprise about that. And I see he was shown in your pictures of plaques. The top line at the middle has Ernest G. Barrows. So he's on it by the library.
Well, that's great. That's that's interesting. It's so hard to try and reconstruct what could have happened. I mean, like, how did his family, what was what did the priest do? Was the priest on their side? Was he? And he must have been on their side. Obviously, all the rest of Ernest Barrows' family was buried there. But how far did he fight? Was it really just about the money in the military? Like, what were their goals? I wonder if this is not only something that was just about Ernest Barrows, but I wonder if this was systematic and happened to many, many other people. And it would be very interesting to find out how many people were not allowed to be buried, how many Cape Verdeans were not allowed to be buried, as a result of this post-World War II military racism. So that's really, really interesting. Other questions, comments? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for your time. I know you have lots of things to do with your mornings. I